Hello, my name is Anne Giardini, and I'm very grateful to be here on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. I am in part a writer, and as a writer, I've always been fascinated by questions of identity, voice, and story. Like a bone in a stock pot, identity fortifies story. So it is in this light that I've been following the controversy about Canadian writer Joseph Boyden's asserted Indigenous roots and the ongoing dialogue that we continue to have about story and ownership. Boyden is the successful writer of 3-Day Road and other well-received books, and he has, as an Indigenous person, been active in reconciliation and Aboriginal activities. He's received awards and recognitions of various kinds, at least some of them earmarked for Indigenous peoples, and has been a frequent spokesperson for Canada's First Nations communities. And then last year, something happened. Journalist Jorge Barrera and others reported that Boyden, who was raised in a suburb of Toronto, was primarily of Irish heritage, as Boyden has acknowledged, and that there was little or no evidence to back Boyden's various and conflicting claims of Mi'kmaq, Métis, Nipmuc, Ojibwe, and other Indigenous roots. I first met Joseph Boyden in 2005, when both of our first novels were shortlisted for the Amazon First Novel Award. He won, but I'm not bitter. A few years later, we were both at the Iceland Writers' Retreat and spent time together over meals and drinks. So what gives with Joseph Boyden? I believe, and this is just my theory, that Boyden found that an Indigenous identity made his voice and stories stronger and richer and more resonant, an Aboriginal bone in a Canadian-Irish pot. Over time, he may have concluded that, Aboriginal or not, he was doing some good and no harm. In following this story, I found myself deeply dissatisfied with the narrative in mainstream media. There was a far richer conversation going on elsewhere, in comments and articles and posts and tweets and the like by men and women from Aboriginal communities in Canada and internationally. These analyses tended to be fierce on the subject of story and identity and ownership. This guy's taking up our space, some said. He's using up all the air in the room. He's taking stories that don't belong to him or that he lacks the context for. He doesn't have that lifetime of slights and aggressions and exclusions and deprivations that characterizes the lives of many First Canadian, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. It was observed, too, that he may have tilted too readily toward reconciliation and let colonial Canada off the hook too easily. For example, Shadi Hafetz, a self-described Algonquin and Anishinaabe Syrian, great combination, said of Boyden, he makes Canada's history of abuse, genocide, and assimilation of Indigenous peoples easy to stomach and relegates it to a distant place or an even more distant past. Chelsea Vowell, a Métis writer, lawyer, and intellectual, whose latest book is called Indigenous Rights, A Guide to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Issues in Canada, posted many insightful and disquieting comments as the story unfolded, as did many others. I found these voices jarring, authentic, and compelling. And I was struck, as I said, by how few of these views made it to the national media. Instead, they ran stories that were overwhelmingly by men and by non-Aboriginal observers. These less mainstream views challenged my assumptions. They made me less comfortable about the state of Canada and the role of Indigenous people in it than had Boyden's more integrated perspectives. They unsettled me. And I use the word unsettled deliberately. This was not the smooth and easy dialogue of the homogeneous group. We all read Daniel Kahneman's book, or we should, Thinking Fast and Slow, so we know that first perspectives are not to be trusted. What we think we know about diversity is very often wrong. A recent letter from Sarah Walker, published in the March 16th London Review of Books, included this wonderful passage. Research, she wrote, suggests that people perceive men and women, whether in zombie movies, panel games, crowd scenes, or business meetings, as equally represented when the male-to-female ratio they are looking at actually hovers around 83 men to 17 women. They start to regard situations as unduly female-dominated when women approach 30% of those present. Like many long-time Canadian families, my own family has several Aboriginal ancestors, Cree, Ojibwe, and Algonquin. But I have no claim other than that faintest palimpsest to Aboriginal experience or voice. As a woman, and as someone involved in the arts, and because I spend meaningful time in the company of people who hold non-dominant views, and because I hold several non-dominant views myself, I have spent much of my working career representing diversity. But do I truly represent diversity? I am a middle-class, middle-aged, blonde, well, not really blonde, university-educated, legally trained woman. Does a woman like me represent diversity, or are we the least threatening alternative to the status quo? The question pretty much answers itself. At a time in which the truth itself appears threatened, diversity is directly tied to the preservation and creation of culture, because the experience of people with different backgrounds enables them to ask and help to resolve important questions that go to the root of who we are and how we should act and how we act in our day-to-day lives. There's a saying that I love. The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. Who said it first is debated. Canada's greatest strength is that we generally get along. We are famously polite. But this politeness is a weakness if it means that what needs saying or doing doesn't get said or done. We live in a world in which disruption has become the norm, accelerated by new technologies, cultural shifts, demographic transformations, geopolitical affairs, climate change, and other factors that sometimes work together, sometimes in opposition. This makes us fearful. Some of us fear disorder, some fear the established order. In Canada, we have a wealth of true varied perspectives readily available to us. We create a better country when we listen, when we get out of the way, when we who are gateholders open the gates, when we are truly prepared to be unsettled. I'll end with some words lightly adapted from local social activist Kelsey Cham Corbett. She said, "The more we found our work on real relationships, on foundations of trust and joy and compassion, the more creative freedom we'll gain and the more willingness we'll have to extend ourselves outward. And then we can affect change beyond ourselves and create inspired communities of support that defy the systems we live in." Thank you.